Summer teachers, what was the last straw that made you quit your job? If I had known what I was getting into, maybe I would have made a different choice. But then again, maybe not. Life has a funny way of throwing curveballs at you, and teaching that particular class was more like standing in the batter's box with a blindfold on, trying to dodge fastballs. This was my first year teaching, and I was full of the idealism and enthusiasm that comes with the territory. I had visions of molding young minds, sparking curiosity, and making a difference. Little did I know that my biggest challenge wouldn't be the curriculum or the long hours, but the students themselves. The class I inherited was notorious within the school. Even the veteran teachers would shudder when they spoke of them, a group of students known for their ability to break even the most seasoned educators. They were rowdy, disrespectful, and some had standardized test scores so low that it was a wonder they hadn't fallen through the cracks altogether. I remember standing in front of that classroom on the first day, watching the chaos unfold before me, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. At the start, things were rough. Control was something I struggled to maintain. I'd spend more time managing behavior than actually teaching. My days felt like a series of battles, each one leaving me more exhausted than the last. I tried different strategies, read countless books on classroom management, and even sought advice from my more experienced colleagues, though their expressions often said more than their words ever could. "Good luck," they'd say, their eyes filled with pity. As the weeks went by, I slowly started to find my footing. I developed a behavior management system that seemed to work, at least for most of the students. I introduced a reward system that incentivized good behavior, and gradually I began to see some improvement. The class became slightly less chaotic, and I found moments of actual teaching slipping through the cracks of discipline. However, there was one student who continued to be a challenge. Let's call her Emily. Emily was different from the others. She wasn't just disruptive, she was withdrawn, almost unreachable. Her behavior oscillated between apathy and outbursts of anger. I tried everything I could think of to reach her, but nothing seemed to work. I felt like I was failing her, and it gnawed at me daily. Then, one day toward the end of the year, Emily stayed after class. She waited until the room was empty before she approached me, her eyes downcast. She started to talk, and what she revealed broke my heart. She told me about her struggles with cutting, her eating disorder, and the abuse she endured at home. In that moment, the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together. Her behavior wasn't just rebellion, it was a cry for help. From that day on, Emily and I formed a fragile bond. She began to trust me, and I tried my best to support her. I referred her to the school counselor and checked in on her regularly. Slowly, she started to improve, not just in behavior, but academically as well. By the end of the year, her test scores had gone up, and she was no longer the disruptive force she had once been. But it wasn't just Emily who showed improvement. The entire class did. Their behavior, their grades, their attitudes, all of it improved. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but we had made progress. I felt a sense of accomplishment that I hadn't thought possible at the beginning of the year. Then came the evaluation. The principal, a stern woman with a penchant for finding fault, called me into her office. She didn't want to hear about the progress we had made. She was only interested in how bad things had been at the start of the year. She berated me for having such a terrible class and for not seeking help from the teacher they had the year before, a teacher who nearly quit before Thanksgiving because of them. The parents had told me how much they disliked her, so why would I seek help from her? It felt like a punch in the gut. All the hard work, the late nights, the emotional toll. It was all dismissed with a wave of her hand. I wasn't alone in this. A co-worker, also a first-year teacher, had been given a similarly challenging class. She had a student who was violent, who would throw desks and chairs. The principal knew about this and still assigned her that class instead of giving it to a more experienced teacher. She too managed to do great things with her students. And at the end of the year, just as she found out her father had cancer, the school fired her. They couldn't afford to increase the salaries of first-year teachers going into their second year, so they fired all of us. Just when I thought I'd seen the worst of it, the end of the year threw another curveball at me. This time, it wasn't just about me or my struggles, but about one of my students who had already been dealt a rough hand in life. Her name was Mia. Mia was on an individualized education program, IEP, which meant she had some kind of learning disability. I never knew the full extent of her challenges, only that she was frequently non-communicative and disengaged. Her home life was tough too. Her mother was bedridden and dying. Despite everything, Mia found joy in the orchestra, particularly in playing the violin. The orchestra teacher had initially been against her joining, claiming she couldn't be trusted with an instrument, but Mia proved her wrong by showing up, practicing, and loving every moment of it. As the year drew to a close, the orchestra was set to put on a concert. Mia was excited beyond words. She came to school that day all dressed up, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. The concert was set to start at 1:15 p.m. in the gym, and at exactly that time, I encouraged her to head down. But instead of rushing off, she just stood there, silent. Some of her classmates, who were just as excited to see her play, urged her to go, but she shook her head and mumbled that the orchestra director had told her she couldn't play. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I called the head of the special education program to see if he knew anything about this sudden change. He didn't. Together, we tried to unravel what had happened. It turned out that the orchestra director had told Mia that morning she wasn't allowed to play in the concert. Her reason? Mia didn't play very well and couldn't read music. I was furious. It's one thing to struggle with teaching methods or classroom management, but it's another to outright exclude a child, especially one who already faced so many obstacles. It wasn't like this was a professional symphony performance. It was an elementary school orchestra concert. One slightly out-of-tune violin wasn't going to ruin the performance. The head of the special education program, and I tried to convince Mia to join the concert. We reassured her that she deserved to be up there with her peers, that she had worked hard and had every right to play. But the damage was done. She was already humiliated and didn't want to face the stage. I filed every complaint I could think of. This was a blatant case of discrimination against a vulnerable student, a girl of color, on free or reduced lunch with an IEP. The fact that the orchestra director could be so heartless enraged me. But the school's response? Nothing. They didn't care. They didn't take any action against the director, didn't offer Mia any apologies or reassurances. I was so upset and ashamed. It's one thing to screw over your teachers, but it's despicable not to stand up for your most vulnerable students. This incident was the final nail in the coffin for me. It cemented my decision to leave teaching. I realized I couldn't stay in a system that allowed such injustices to occur without consequence. You never really know the full extent of what your students are going through until they start to trust you. By the end of the year, I had become more than just their teacher. I was a confidant, a safe space in an otherwise tumultuous world. It was a role I hadn't anticipated, but one I took seriously. 3 of my students, including Emily, the girl with the eating disorder and a history of self-harm, came to me to reveal the abuse they were suffering at home. They didn't have anyone else to turn to. Our school counselor was on maternity leave, and the administration hadn't bothered to find a replacement. It was just one more way the system was failing these kids. I listened to their stories, each one more heartbreaking than the last. There was the girl who showed me the bruises on her arms and legs, who whispered about the nights she spent hiding from her father's drunken rages. There was the boy who talked about the neglect, how he had to fend for himself because his mother was too strung out to care for him. And then there was Emily, who had already opened up to me about her struggles, now revealing the full extent of the abuse she endured at home. As a mandatory reporter, I had no choice but to go to the principal with this information. I thought naively that she would understand the gravity of the situation and take immediate action. Instead, she listened to me with a skeptical expression, then said something that still makes my blood boil. Well, I believe these 2 girls, but I bet the 3rd one is just making it up for attention. I was stunned. How could she dismiss a 12-year-old's report of abuse so callously? Even if the child was lying, that in itself was a sign of a deeper issue. No kid makes up stories like that for no reason. There's always an underlying problem, a cry for help that needs to be addressed. But the principal didn't care. She didn't do anything to help. Frustrated and angry, I filed the reports myself. I made sure each case was documented thoroughly, even though it felt like shouting into the void. A few weeks later, the home of the 3rd girl, the one the principal had dismissed as a liar, was being investigated. Turns out her story was true. The authorities found evidence of abuse, and actions were taken to ensure her safety. I felt a small sense of vindication, but it was overshadowed by a profound sadness. What kind of adult dismisses a child's cry for help? Maybe the principal thought she was protecting the school's reputation, or maybe she just didn't want to deal with the paperwork. Whatever her reasons, it was inexcusable. These kids deserved better. It was incidents like these that wore me down. The constant fight to be heard, to get my students the help they needed, the emotional toll of listening to their pain and knowing the system was stacked against them. It was all too much. I tried to be there for them, to listen and support them as best I could, but it never felt like enough. Even now, I think back to those days and feel a mix of anger and sorrow. I wonder where those kids are now, if they're safe, if they found the help they so desperately needed. I hope that, in some small way, I made a difference in their lives, even if it was just by believing them when no one else did. The principal's words still echo in my mind. She's making it up for attention. It's a reminder of how deeply flawed the system is, how easy it is for the most vulnerable to be overlooked and dismissed. And it's why I couldn't continue to be a part of it. I didn't quit teaching because of the kids. They were the reason I stayed as long as I did. But the system, the bureaucracy, the indifference, the outright cruelty drove me away. I couldn't keep fighting against a machine that seemed designed to crush the very people it was supposed to protect. So I left. And while I found other ways to make a difference, I'll never forget those kids, their stories, their bravery. They taught me more than I ever taught them, and for that, I'm grateful.